Welcome back everyone. We're filming another video for Excel nerds, and today we're talking more about pivot tables. We have a slightly larger data set. This data set has 3,000 rows. We're working with 1,000 different videos, 5 content types, and January, February, and March data. So we have 3,000 rows. So our goal with this is to show that even though you have 3,000 rows, which seems like a lot, we can very easily summarize this with a pivot table. Let's jump in. I'm going to create a pivot table on this page, but depending on who you're sending it to, you don't necessarily have to do that. Create it on a new sheet or a new tab. So before I jump into putting these various fields into the boxes, I want to talk about a very important concept if you've never worked with structured data before. You want to be looking at the content and figuring out what your dimensions are and your measures. The measures are the things that you can actually measure, like revenue, views, things that are very concrete, quantifiable. Dimensions are the things like the type of content or the month that the views occurred in. The dimensions are really the buckets that you're putting the measures into. It's how you're sorting the data so that people can better understand what's happening. So given that, we know that views and revenue are the metrics we're working with. Sometimes measures and metrics are used interchangeably. So views and revenue can go down here. Let's see what happens. So right off the bat, it's summing up the total across the entire data set. Now look what happens when we add type. The pivot table is automatically sorting the data based on the type of content. So immediately we can see cooking gets a lot of views and makes a lot of money. But we also have this month column here. Let's see what happens when we add it. So here we're getting even more data. We can see over time how the views are increasing for cooking, for example. We can see how the revenue is progressing, and it tells a better story with our data. There's a few things you can do just to better format this pivot table depending on who's seeing this data and what you really want to show. The first thing we can do is hide the totals by going to Design tab, Grand Totals, and then Off for rows and columns. So that turns off both grand totals. We could leave it on for columns only, or we could leave it on for rows only. Depending on what you want, feel free to play around with that. Another thing we can do is actually switch the values that are in the columns box. So instead of month on the bottom, we have month on the top now. So we can see within March, how did views compare to revenue? Within February, how did views compare to revenue? It just depends on how you really want to look at your data, but you can very quickly toggle between the two. Sometimes you might even want to make a copy of a pivot table just so that you have both views available at one glance. So to do that, I would just select all that, Control C for a PC, Command C for a Mac, and then I would paste it in there. Once it's pasted, come into my field list and reverse these. Now I have both views available to me. Another thing you could do is actually add dimensions to your filters box and create a totally different view altogether. So here we have month as a selector in this drop down. We can select January only. Perhaps you only want to see January. You can select January and February together if you just want to know the aggregate. Oftentimes you'll want to see trends over time, so if this doesn't look right, we can always go back to putting month into our columns box, and we can see the trends over time. As you can see, Excel remembered that we wanted to exclude March from our view, so it kept it out. One last thing I'll talk about before I end the video is conditional formatting within your pivot table. The more data you have, the more important it is to really tell a story about what's going on with your data. So if I highlight this column right here and go to color scales, what this conditional formatting is doing is using a dark green down to a white gradient and highlighting the highest value dark green all the way down to white for the lowest value so that you can see the contrast between the different values. And we can immediately see that short films got the most amount of views in January. Depending on what type of story you're trying to tell, there's a ton of other ways to highlight data as well, including data bars, icon sets, different indicators that show whether or not a value is good or not, or passes a test of some kind. You can use ratings, different kinds of indicators like this. So the best thing to do is really just to dive into your pivot table and start playing around and see what story you can tell with your data.